Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we are taking a completely objective and frankly, absolutely fascinating look at the cultural and scientific roots of one of the most persistent conversations in modern history, the creation versus evolution debate. We're going to really unpack the source material here to understand the deep foundational frameworks that actually guide these discussions. To truly wrap our heads around this topic without taking sides, we're going to look at it through a purely analytical lens, peeling back the layers of definitions, history, and paradigms. We'll be covering the tension of origins, data versus interpretation, clarifying the actual debate, the rule of biogenesis, and finally, Darwin's perfect storm. So, Section 1, the tension of origins, cultural shifts, and worldview divides. That intense tension people feel around this topic isn't just a debate about microscopes and fossils. It's a massive clash of fundamental worldviews and our very identities. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the sources data showing exactly how these views have shifted over time. If we look at Gallup polls from 1999 to 2024, there's a huge cultural shift. Over that 25-year span, support for naturalistic evolution, which is the idea that life arose without any divine intervention, literally nearly tripled. It jumped from 9% to 24%. And at the exact same time, views favoring a recent creation dropped to historic lows. And we see a very similar paradigm within the scientific community itself. A 1998 survey of the National Academy of Sciences showed that 72% of these leading scientists do not believe in a personal God. Only about 7% said yes, they do. Now, the source makes a really thoughtful point here. Neutrally speaking, this data absolutely doesn't prove or disprove God. Rather, it just reveals the naturalistic paradigm that forms the baseline starting point for a lot of leading scientists when they evaluate evidence. Moving right along to Section 2, data versus interpretation, how we view the facts. The core concept to grasp here is that facts and data are static, right? They don't change. But the way we interpret them is heavily filtered by our personal worldviews. To break that down, we really have to look at the difference between hard science and historical science. Hard science is stuff you can observe and repeat in a lab right now. Historical science, on the other hand, involves building models of an unrepeatable past based on the data we have in the present. The source uses a great analogy. Think of the Pilgrims coming to America. The date they arrived, that is a hard historical fact. But interpreting their exact motivations, was it religious freedom or was it economic gain? That requires a worldview lens. The exact same principle applies when scientists interpret ancient fossils or rock layers. Which brings us to a fascinating concept called methodological naturalism. This quote from evolutionary biologist Richard Lewontin brilliantly illustrates it. He wrote, "We have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door." Now, this isn't some malicious conspiracy. It is just a working paradigm. Scientists restrict themselves to material causes within their methodology. It's much like ancient alchemists trying to turn lead into gold. They weren't foolish. They were just operating entirely within their own limited framework. All right, Section 3, clarifying the actual debate, defining our terms. Because, as it turns out, the phrase creation versus evolution is actually a massive misnomer, and we really need to separate the origin of life from the changing of life. The first massive question we have to tackle is simply, how did life begin? And what's crucial to understand here is that the theory of evolution requires a living, replicating population to already exist. So by definition, evolution actually cannot answer how life first started from non-living chemistry. Because of that, the true foundational debate in origins is not creation versus evolution. It is creation, the idea that life originates from an intelligent source, versus spontaneous origin, also known as abiogenesis, which is the idea that life arose entirely naturally from non-living matter. Once life actually exists, well, that's when scientists ask the second major question: how does life change over time? So the crucial point is understanding the absolute difference between microevolution and macroevolution. Microevolution refers to observable genetic shifts within a population. And you know what? Almost no one debates this. The real disagreement, the actual core of the debate, is whether those small, micro changes can accumulate over vast periods of time into macroevolution, producing entirely new kinds of organism. To show you just how undisputed microevolution actually is, the source shares this fascinating anecdote about African elephants in Uganda. Back in the 1930s, only about 1% of these elephants were naturally tuskless. But because heavy poaching specifically targeted the elephants with large tusks, the tuskless ones were the ones surviving and reproducing. Fast forward to 1998, and up to 30% of the adult elephants were tuskless. That is a highly observable, totally non-controversial adaptation to environmental pressure. Next up, Section 4, the rule of biogenesis, the history of spontaneous life. We're pivoting now to the history of scientific experimentation and how humanity used to literally believe life just poofed into existence from non-living matter. Trace the historical timeline with me for a second. Centuries ago, people actually believed that if you threw a sweaty shirt in a corner with some wheat, it would magically generate mice, or that maggots spontaneously came from decaying meat. But science systematically disproved this. In the 1600s, Francesco Redi proved maggots came from flies. In the 1700s, Needham and Spallanzani debated microorganisms. And finally, in the 1800s, Louis Pasteur used his famous swan neck flasks to definitively show that microorganisms came from other microorganisms in the air, not the broth itself. Those experiments absolutely cemented a foundational biological principle called biogenesis. Life always comes from pre-existing life. And this forces modern researchers to wrestle with a pretty staggering puzzle. Because if life only comes from life, where did the very first cell come from? That first cell wasn't just a simple blob of jelly, it was an irreducibly complex microscopic factory packed with molecular machines. Explaining how unguided chemistry built that factory is still a huge challenge today. Let's move to and see how this builds into Section 5, Darwin's perfect storm, the shift in paradigms. Let's look at the 19th century intellectual climate that allowed Charles Darwin's theories to really take root. The source lays out a literal perfect storm of 4 factors. First, higher criticism in universities was weakening the Bible's historical standing. Second, exciting new fossil discoveries, like the Archaeopteryx, were totally capturing the public's imagination. Third, scientists had a very limited knowledge of genetics at the time, which made cellular change seem a whole lot simpler than we now know it is. And fourth, geologists were introducing concepts of deep time, which provided the millions of years seemingly needed for evolution. When Darwin observed those Galapagos finchbeaks adapting to their environments, he dropped his theory of natural selection into an intellectual climate perfectly primed for it. Today, a lot of this conversation focuses on how we actually detect design. The source provides a brilliant analogy here. If you see a rock shaped roughly like a face, you'd probably attribute it to wind erosion, right? Just a random natural process. But if you walk up to Mount Rushmore, you instantly recognize the precise design of an intelligent agency. Recognizing design isn't just a religious discussion. It's a legitimate, evidence-based scientific one. The real debate is whether complex biological systems exhibit the characteristics that legitimately point to design, or if they are purely the result of undirected natural processes. And that brings us to the ultimate question at the core of this whole explainer. When you look at the sheer, immense complexity of the world around us, from the intricate machinery of a single cell to the vastness of the cosmos, what paradigm makes the most sense to you? Is the universe the product of blind processes, time and chance? Or does the evidence point toward design and intention? It's a massive, paradigm-shifting question, and it's one that I hope you are now eager to explore even further on your own. Thanks for joining me today.